The morning sun cast long shadows across the military recruitment center in downtown San Diego as Sarah Martinez walked through the glass doors. At 28, she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of overcoming challenges that would break most people. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans and a navy blue sweater that seemed to emphasize the serious expression in her brown eyes. The recruitment office buzzed with activity. Young men and women filled out paperwork at metal desks, while uniformed officers moved between them, offering guidance and answering questions. Sarah approached the main desk, where a stern-looking sergeant sat reviewing applications. "I'd like to speak with someone about my military service records," Sarah said politely, placing a manila folder on the desk. Sergeant Williams looked up, his eyes quickly scanning Sarah from head to toe. Something about her demeanor seemed different from the typical walk-ins he dealt with daily. "What kind of service records, ma'am?" "Navy SEAL records," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. The sergeant's pen stopped moving. He set it down slowly and leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to skeptical disbelief. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "I need assistance accessing my Navy SEAL service documentation. There seems to be an issue with the digital files, and I need hard copies for a job application." An uncomfortable silence fell over the immediate area. The sergeant glanced around, noticing that several nearby conversations had stopped as people strained to listen. Navy SEALs were an elite, all-male unit. Everyone knew that. Women weren't even allowed in combat roles until recent years, let alone in the most exclusive special operations unit in the military. "Ma'am," Sergeant Williams said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Women cannot serve as Navy SEALs. It's not possible." Sarah opened her folder and pulled out several documents, spreading them across the desk. "These are my orders, training completion certificates, and mission records. I understand the confusion, but I assure you my service is legitimate." The sergeant barely glanced at the papers before shaking his head. "Ma'am, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but impersonating a military service member is a federal crime. These documents are obviously fake." "They're not fake," Sarah said calmly, though her jaw tightened slightly. "If you'd just look at them properly." "I don't need to look at them," the sergeant interrupted, standing up abruptly. His voice had risen enough to draw attention from across the room. "What I'm looking at is someone trying to claim service in a unit that has never and will never accept women. Do you have any idea how disrespectful this is to the men who actually earned that title?" Sarah felt the familiar sting of frustration and anger, but she kept her voice level. "Sergeant, I understand your skepticism, but if you would just verify these documents through proper channels—" "The only thing I'm going to verify is your identity so I can file a proper report," he cut her off. By now, several other staff members had gathered around, and the tension in the room was thick. "Stolen valor is not something we take lightly here." "I'm not claiming false service," Sarah said, her patience wearing thin. "I'm asking for help with legitimate military records." But the sergeant was already reaching for his phone. Within minutes, 2 military police officers arrived at the recruitment center. Sarah watched as Sergeant Williams spoke to them in hushed tones, occasionally pointing in her direction. She could see the disbelief and disgust on their faces as they listened to his explanation. The MPs approached her with the kind of cautious authority used when dealing with someone who might be unstable. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," the taller of the two said. "On what grounds?" Sarah asked, though she remained seated and calm. "Suspicion of impersonating a military service member and stolen valor," the MP replied. "You have the right to remain silent." As they read her rights, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of anger and resignation wash over her. This wasn't the first time her claims had been met with disbelief, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But she also knew that eventually the truth would come out. It always did. The handcuffs clicked into place around her wrists, cold metal against her skin. Several people in the recruitment office had stopped what they were doing entirely now, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Sarah could hear whispered conversations and see the shaking heads of disapproval. "This is ridiculous," someone muttered loud enough for her to hear. "Some people have no shame." As they escorted her out of the building, Sarah caught her reflection in the glass doors. She looked like exactly what everyone assumed she was, just another civilian trying to claim glory that wasn't hers. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very people whose job it was to honor military service were the ones who refused to believe hers existed. The ride to the military police station was conducted in tense silence. Sarah stared out the window at the familiar streets of San Diego, a city where she had spent years training in some of the most grueling conditions imaginable. The beaches where she had endured Hell Week looked peaceful from the back of the police car, giving no hint of the brutal trials she had faced there. At the station, they processed her like any other suspect. Fingerprints, photographs, personal belongings cataloged and stored. The intake officer, a young woman not much older than Sarah herself, seemed almost embarrassed by the situation. "I have to ask," the officer said quietly as she filled out paperwork. "Why would you claim something like this? Navy SEALs are... it's just not possible for a woman." Sarah looked at her steadily. "Because it's the truth." The officer shook her head sadly, as if Sarah were suffering from some kind of delusion. "Ma'am, I really think you should consider talking to someone. There are counselors who specialize in helping people who have difficulty distinguishing between fantasy and reality." "I don't need a counselor," Sarah replied. "I need someone to actually look at my service records instead of dismissing them because they don't fit your expectations." They placed her in a small holding cell to wait for whatever came next. The concrete walls were painted an institutional green, and a single fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Sarah had been in worse places, much worse, but the injustice of the situation made it feel particularly oppressive. Hours passed. Through the small window in her cell door, Sarah could see MPs coming and going, handling other cases. Occasionally, someone would walk by and glance in at her with curiosity or disdain. She became a story to tell, the woman who tried to claim she was a Navy SEAL. Late in the afternoon, she heard voices approaching her cell. Through the window, she could see two figures walking down the hallway with one of the duty officers. One was clearly military, but the other wore civilian clothes and walked with the kind of bearing that suggested high rank despite the lack of uniform. "This is highly irregular," she heard one of them saying. "We've had people claim false service before, but Navy SEAL, that's either incredibly bold or incredibly delusional." "Yes, sir," the duty officer replied. The recruitment center sergeant said she had documents, but obviously they had to be forgeries. No one took them seriously enough for a detailed examination. The footsteps stopped outside her cell. Sarah looked up to see three men peering through the window at her. The civilian-dressed man appeared to be in his 60s, with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades of military service. His eyes were sharp and calculating as he studied her through the glass. "Open it," he said quietly. "Sir?" the duty officer asked, uncertain. "Open the cell. I want to speak with her." The lock clicked, and the door swung open. Sarah stood as the three men entered the small space. The older man stepped forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm General Morrison," he said simply. "I understand you're claiming to be a Navy SEAL." "I'm not claiming anything," Sarah replied. "I am a Navy SEAL, or was, until my medical discharge last year." The general's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "What's your rate?" "SO1, Sarah answered without hesitation. "Special Operations Petty Officer First Class." "What class?" "Class 273. General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. Then his eyes dropped slightly, focusing on something at the base of Sarah's throat. Even through her sweater, the edge of something was barely visible, what looked like the corner of a tattoo. "May I see your left shoulder?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then pulled down the neck of her sweater slightly, revealing a small but distinctive tattoo, a trident surrounded by an eagle with the number 273 below it. It was the unofficial but widely recognized mark that SEAL team members often got after completing their training. The general stared at the tattoo for several long seconds. Sarah watched his expression change from skeptical authority to something much more complex: surprise, recognition, and what might have been respect. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, so quietly that the other men couldn't hear him. Then, louder, "Everyone out! Now!" "Sir?" the duty officer questioned. "Everyone out of this cell immediately. And I want those handcuffs off her right now." As the MPs scrambled to comply, Sarah saw something in the general's eyes that she hadn't seen in a long time, someone who believed her. But she also saw something else: fear. Not fear of her, but fear of what her presence might mean. The handcuffs fell away from Sarah's wrists with a metallic click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the cell. General Morrison waited until the duty officer and MPs had left before closing the door behind them. The small space felt even more cramped with just the two of them, but the atmosphere had completely changed. "Sit down," the general said, his voice much softer now. Sarah remained standing, her arms crossed, studying the man who had just ordered her release. After hours of being treated like a criminal, she wasn't ready to trust anyone completely. General Morrison seemed to understand her hesitation. He moved slowly, deliberately, pulling a small folding chair from outside the cell and setting it down before sitting himself on the concrete bench that served as the cell's only furniture. "Sarah Elena Martinez," he said quietly, reading from memory rather than any document. "Born in El Paso, Texas, enlisted in the Navy at 19, completed basic training at Great Lakes, then BUD/S training in Coronado. Member of SEAL Team 3. Specialized in underwater demolition and reconnaissance. Purple Heart recipient. Medically discharged following injuries sustained during a classified operation in Syria." Sarah felt her defensive posture soften slightly. This wasn't information that would be readily available to just anyone. "How do you know all that?" "Because 5 years ago, I was briefed on the military's most classified experimental program," Morrison replied. "Operation Silent Depths, a program so secret that even most senior commanders didn't know it existed." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Operation Silent Depths was something she had hoped never to hear again, a chapter of her life that was supposed to remain buried in classified files forever. Her hand unconsciously moved to her shoulder, where beneath the sweater, scars from that final mission created a roadmap of pain across her skin. "You weren't supposed to exist," Morrison continued, his voice heavy with what might have been regret. "Officially, you still don't. The program was terminated, all records sealed or destroyed. Everyone involved was reassigned or retired. It was as if it never happened." "But it did happen," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We happened." "We?" Sarah looked directly at him, and for the first time since entering that recruitment office, she allowed some of the walls she had built around herself to crack. "There were 12 of us initially, women who were recruited for a pilot program to test female integration into special operations units. We went through the same training as every other SEAL candidate: Hell Week, combat diving, weapons training, survival courses. Some of us didn't make it, but 4 of us did." Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. "What happened to the others?" "Jessica died in Afghanistan during our 3rd deployment. IED explosion took out her entire vehicle. Maria was killed 6 months later during a hostage rescue operation in Somalia. Sniper got her during extraction. And Rebecca? Sarah paused, the pain still fresh even after all this time. Rebecca took her own life 2 years after the program was terminated. She couldn't handle being erased from existence, having her service denied, pretending that the most important thing she'd ever done never happened. The general was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what Sarah had just told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than before. "I'm sorry. I knew the program had been disbanded, but I wasn't aware of the casualties." "Casualties?" Sarah repeated bitterly. "That's what we became, isn't it? Acceptable losses in a political game we never agreed to play?" Morrison stood and began pacing the small cell, his hands clasped behind his back. The program was ahead of its time, too far ahead. When word leaked to certain members of Congress about women being trained as SEALs, there was massive pushback. Accusations of social engineering, concerns about unit cohesion, fears about political correctness undermining military effectiveness. The Pentagon made a decision to shut it down quietly rather than fight a public battle they weren't sure they could win. "So they just erased us," Sarah said. "4 women who had proven themselves capable of doing the job, and they made us disappear." "It wasn't that simple." "It was exactly that simple," Sarah interrupted, her anger finally breaking through. "We served with honor. We completed missions that male SEALs couldn't or wouldn't take on. We saved lives, gathered intelligence, eliminated threats to national security, and our reward was to be told that none of it ever happened." Morrison stopped pacing and turned to face her. "You're right. What happened to you and your team was wrong. But you have to understand the political climate at the time. The military was already facing criticism for various integration policies. The leadership felt that acknowledging the program's existence would create more problems than it solved." "More problems for whom?" Sarah demanded. "Because it created plenty of problems for us." "Do you know what it's like to apply for jobs and not be able to list your most significant work experience? To have people look at you like you're delusional when you try to get benefits for injuries sustained in service to your country? To watch your teammates struggle with PTSD from missions that officially never happened?" The general sat back down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. "No, I don't know what that's like, and I can't imagine how difficult it must have been." Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or political calculation. What she saw instead was genuine remorse and something that might have been shame. "Why are you here, General? Why did you come to see me?" Morrison was quiet for several minutes, seemingly wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression of grim determination. "Because things are changing. The political landscape is different now than it was 5 years ago. Women are serving in combat roles. Integration is moving forward rather than backward. And there are people in positions of power who believe the military made a mistake in how it handled Operation Silent Depths." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that there might be an opportunity to correct some of the wrongs that were done, to acknowledge what you and your teammates accomplished, to give you the recognition and benefits you deserve." Sarah felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. But it was quickly tempered by the cynicism that had grown from years of disappointment. "Why now? Why after all this time?" "Several reasons," Morrison replied. "First, there's been a generational change in military leadership. Many of the officers who were opposed to women in combat roles have retired. Second, the success of women in other combat positions has proven that the concerns about female integration were largely unfounded. And third," he hesitated, and Sarah sensed there was something more significant he wasn't yet ready to reveal. "Third, there's been a development that requires the expertise of someone with your particular skill set, a situation that might be uniquely suited to your capabilities." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You're being deliberately vague." Because I can't discuss operational details in a holding cell, Morrison said with a slight smile, the first she had seen from him. But I can tell you that if you're interested in returning to active duty, there might be opportunities available. Active duty? Sarah's mind reeled at the possibility. After years of being told her service had never existed, the idea of returning to the military seemed almost surreal. I was medically discharged. Discharges can be reviewed and reversed under certain circumstances, Morrison explained, especially when there are compelling operational needs and exceptional circumstances surrounding the original discharge. Sarah stood and walked to the small window in the cell door, looking out at the hallway where MPs continued their daily routines. For them, this was just another day processing another suspect. They had no idea that the woman they had arrested that morning might be about to re-enter a world she had been forced to leave behind. What would it mean? She asked without turning around. If I agreed to consider this opportunity, it would mean acknowledgement, Morrison said simply. Official recognition of your service with Operation Silent Depths. It would mean your records being unsealed and properly documented. It would mean back pay, proper benefits, and medical care for service-connected injuries. And in exchange, one mission, high priority, classified with the kind of specific requirements that make you one of only a handful of people qualified to execute it successfully. Sarah turned back to face him. The general was watching her carefully, gauging her reaction to his words. She could see that this wasn't just about correcting past wrongs. There was something immediate and urgent driving this offer. How do I know this isn't just another political game? She asked. How do I know I won't complete whatever mission you're talking about only to be erased again when it's convenient? Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking document, handing it to Sarah. Even folded, she could see the presidential seal at the top. Because this time, the authorization comes from the very top. The president himself has signed off on this operation and the acknowledgement of Operation Silent Depths. This isn't some Pentagon program that can be quietly terminated. This is a matter of national security with full executive branch support. Sarah unfolded the document, scanning the formal language that officially acknowledged the existence of Operation Silent Depths and authorized the recall of remaining personnel for active duty. Her hands trembled slightly as she read her own name listed among those approved for reinstatement. "This is real," she whispered. "It's real," Morrison confirmed. "The question is, are you ready to be a Navy SEAL again?" Before Sarah could answer, there was a sharp knock on the cell door. A young MP peered through the window, his expression urgent. "General Morrison, sir? We need to speak with you immediately. There's been a development." Morrison stood quickly, his demeanor shifting back to military efficiency. "What kind of development?" "Sir, we just received word that the target you've been tracking has been located. Intelligence suggests they're planning to move within the next 48 hours. Sarah watched the general's expression change, saw the weight of command settle back onto his shoulders. Whatever mission he had been alluding to had just become much more immediate. He turned back to Sarah. "I need an answer, now." Sarah looked down at the document in her hands, at the presidential seal that represented validation she had thought would never come. She thought about Jessica, Maria, and Rebecca, her teammates who would never see this moment of acknowledgement. She thought about the years of denying her own identity, of pretending that the most meaningful period of her life had never existed. "What's the mission?" she asked. Morrison glanced at the MP waiting outside, then back at Sarah. "There's a terrorist cell planning an attack on a naval installation. They've managed to infiltrate the base using someone with inside knowledge of security protocols. Traditional approaches haven't worked. They've anticipated every move we've made. We need someone who can think differently, who can get close without raising suspicion. Someone like me." "Someone exactly like you," Morrison confirmed. Your background in underwater operations and your ability to blend into civilian environments make you uniquely qualified for this particular insertion." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decision settling over her. After years in the wilderness, she was being offered a chance to return home. But home came with danger, responsibility, and the possibility of once again being denied and erased. "If I do this," she said finally, "I want guarantees, not just for myself but for my teammates' families. Full benefits, death benefits, acknowledgement of their service. Done. And if something happens to me during this mission?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "Then you die as a recognized Navy SEAL, with full honors and a legacy that will never be denied or hidden again." Sarah nodded slowly. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than she had dared hope for in years. "Then let's go save a naval installation." Within an hour of Sarah's agreement, the military police station had transformed into an impromptu command center. The same holding area where she had been imprisoned now buzzed with activity as intelligence officers, communications specialists, and tactical advisors set up equipment and established secure connections to various command centers. Sarah sat at a metal table that had been brought in, wearing a fresh Navy uniform that someone had retrieved from stores. The fabric felt familiar yet strange against her skin. She had almost forgotten the weight and texture of military dress. Across from her, General Morrison and a woman introduced as Colonel Patricia Hayes, Navy Intelligence, spread classified documents and satellite photos across the table's surface. "Naval Station Norfolk," Colonel Hayes began, pointing to aerial photographs of the massive Virginia installation. "Home to the largest naval base in the world, with over 75 ships and 134 aircraft. 3 days ago, our intelligence networks picked up chatter about a planned attack on the facility." Sarah studied the images, her trained eye automatically identifying potential vulnerabilities and access points. "What kind of attack?" "Unknown," Morrison replied. "But the intercepted communications suggest something significant enough to cripple naval operations in the Atlantic for months. The terrorist cell has been planning this for over 2 years, and they've demonstrated knowledge of security protocols that should be impossible for outsiders to obtain." Colonel Hayes pulled out another set of photographs, these showing individual faces. "We've identified the cell leader as Yusuf al-Rashid, former Iraqi special forces who turned to terrorism after the fall of Saddam's regime. Intelligence, ruthless, and patient. He's been operating in the United States for almost 3 years under various identities." "How did he get inside knowledge of Norfolk's security?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Someone on the inside," Morrison confirmed grimly. "We have reason to believe that al-Rashid or his associates have either compromised an existing naval personnel member or placed an agent within the facility. Our counterintelligence efforts have been unsuccessful in identifying the source." Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the information. "So you need someone who can get close to the cell without triggering their insiders' warnings. Someone they wouldn't expect." "Exactly," Colonel Hayes said. "Traditional infiltration approaches have failed because they somehow anticipate our moves. Male operatives have been identified and neutralized before they could gather meaningful intelligence. We need a different approach." "A female approach," Sarah said. "Your approach," Morrison corrected. "Al-Rashid has a known weakness for recruiting women into his organization. He believes they're less likely to be suspected by security forces and more capable of gaining access to sensitive areas through social engineering. Intelligence suggests he's actively seeking to add another female operative to his cell." Sarah studied the photographs of al-Rashid, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the calculated cruelty in his expression. "What's my cover?" Colonel Hayes slid a thick folder across the table. "Marina Santos, recently discharged Navy communications specialist looking for work in the private security sector. Your background has been carefully constructed to make you attractive to his recruitment efforts. Technical skills, military training, and financial difficulties that might make you susceptible to ideological or monetary persuasion. And my real mission? Morrison leaned forward. Identify the insider at Norfolk, determine the exact nature of the planned attack, and gather enough evidence for us to move against the entire cell simultaneously. We'll only get one chance at this. If we move too early or miss any members of the group, they'll scatter and regroup elsewhere. Sarah opened the cover identity folder, scanning the detailed personal history that had been created for Marina Santos. It was thorough and believable, with enough genuine military knowledge woven throughout to withstand scrutiny from someone with al-Rashid's background. How do I make contact? Al-Rashid frequents a bar called Murphy's near the Norfolk base, Colonel Hayes explained. It's popular with discharged military personnel and defense contractors. Marina Santos will start showing up there, displaying the right combination of skills, vulnerability, and subtle desperation that should attract his attention. Timeline? Morrison's expression grew urgent. Intelligence suggests they plan to execute their attack within the next week. You have 5 days maximum to infiltrate the cell, identify their target and methods, and locate the insider. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with accepting a dangerous mission. It had been over a year since she had experienced this sensation, and she had forgotten how addictive it could be. Support? Minimal, Morrison admitted. We can't risk exposure by having obvious backup. You'll have a communications device disguised as a fitness tracker, check-in protocols, and emergency extraction procedures. But for the most part, you'll be operating alone. Just like old times, Sarah murmured, thinking of the solo missions she had run during Operation Silent Depths. Colonel Hayes pulled out one final document. There's something else. We have reason to believe that if this attack succeeds, it won't be the end. Intelligence suggests this is part of a larger coordinated campaign against multiple naval installations. Norfolk is either the first target or a test run for something even bigger. The weight of that revelation settled over the room. Sarah understood now why they had been willing to resurrect Operation Silent Depths and acknowledge her service. This wasn't just about one terrorist cell or one planned attack. It was about preventing a coordinated assault on American naval capabilities. What's the extraction plan if things go wrong? She asked. Morrison hesitated. There isn't one. If you're compromised, we can't risk a rescue operation that might alert the cell to abort their plans. You'll be completely on your own until the mission is complete. Sarah had expected as much, but hearing it stated plainly still sent a chill down her spine. It was the same calculation that had governed her work during Operation Silent Depths. Mission success took priority over individual safety. I understand. Over the next several hours, Sarah immersed herself in the details of her cover identity and the intelligence they had gathered on al-Rashid's organization. She studied surveillance photos, memorized biographical details, and reviewed technical specifications that Marina Santos would be expected to know. By evening, she had internalized every aspect of her false identity. As the command center began to wind down for the night, General Morrison approached her with a small, sealed envelope. "What's this?" Sarah asked. "Letters from the families of your teammates," he explained quietly. "Jessica's mother, Maria's sister, Rebecca's parents. They wanted you to know that they're proud of what you accomplished together, and they're grateful that your service is finally being acknowledged." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope. She had had no contact with her teammates' families since the program was terminated, unsure whether they even knew the details of their daughter's military service. How did they know? "I contacted them personally after the president signed the acknowledgement order," Morrison said. "They deserve to know that their daughter's sacrifices are finally being recognized. They also wanted you to know that you have their support for whatever comes next." Sarah carefully placed the envelope in her jacket pocket, too emotional to read the letters immediately. "Thank you. There's one more thing," Morrison added. If this mission is successful, there are discussions about re-establishing a women's special operations program. Not as a secret experiment this time, but as an official part of military structure. Your work could pave the way for an entire new generation of female special operators. The implications of that statement weren't lost on Sarah. This mission wasn't just about stopping a terrorist attack. It was about proving that women belonged in special operations, that the cancellation of Operation Silent Depths had been a mistake that shouldn't be repeated. 2 days later, Sarah walked into Murphy's bar wearing civilian clothes and the carefully practiced expression of someone trying to project confidence while hiding desperation. The bar was exactly what she had expected, dimly lit, filled with military memorabilia, and populated by a mix of active duty personnel and veterans trying to find their place in civilian life. She ordered a beer and found a seat at the bar, positioning herself where she would be visible, but not obviously looking for attention. According to intelligence reports, Al-Rashid typically arrived around 9 p.m. and spent several hours observing potential recruits before making any approach. As the evening wore on, Sarah nursed her drink and engaged in casual conversation with other patrons, building her cover as Marina Santos while scanning the room for her target. At 9:15, a man matching Al-Rashid's description entered the bar. He was shorter than she had expected, but carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. For the next hour, Sarah felt his attention on her as she played her role perfectly. Skilled but struggling, proud but vulnerable, loyal but disillusioned. When he finally approached her table, she was ready. "You seem like someone with interesting stories," he said in lightly accented English, sliding into the seat across from her without invitation. "Don't we all?" Sarah replied, taking a sip of her beer and meeting his eyes with the right mixture of wariness and curiosity. "Some stories are more interesting than others. I understand you recently left the Navy." "News travels fast around here," Sarah said, neither confirming nor denying his statement. Al-Rashid smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I make it my business to know about people with certain skills who might be looking for new opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" "The kind that pay well and appreciate talent that the military sometimes undervalues." Over the next 2 hours, Al-Rashid carefully probed Sarah's background, testing her cover story and gauging her potential usefulness to his organization. Sarah responded with exactly the right balance of interest and caution, allowing him to believe he was gradually winning her trust while gathering information about his operations. By the time they parted that evening, Al-Rashid had invited Marina Santos to meet with him again the following night to discuss business opportunities that might interest someone with her background. Sarah knew she had successfully taken the first step into the terrorist cell, but she also understood that the real danger was just beginning. As she walked back to her hotel, Sarah felt the weight of her mission settling fully onto her shoulders. 3 days remained until the suspected attack, and she was now committed to a path that would either prevent a catastrophic terrorist assault or result in her own death as a failed infiltrator. The letters from her teammates' families seemed to burn in her jacket pocket, reminding her that she was no longer fighting just for herself or even for her country. She was fighting for the memory of women who had died believing their service would never be acknowledged, and for the future of women who might follow in their footsteps. Tomorrow night, she would take the next step deeper into Al-Rashid's organization. By week's end, she would either have prevented a devastating attack on American naval forces or become another casualty in the ongoing war against terrorism. But unlike her previous missions during Operation Silent Depths, this time her sacrifice would be remembered and honored. Sarah Martinez, Navy SEAL, was finally going home.